Gleason in the movie says they're the greatest team ever, period, right? I had my buddy or a researcher go to the Chicago History Museum to find Gleason's testimony from the trial. Doesn't exist. I'm saying to myself, how can there not be Gleason's testimony? So did he say that? I've checked every newspaper under the sun from when he tested. He didn't say that. Now, he never badmouthed his guys after that trial ended.
That was Salve Regina baseball coach Dirk Baker. Hello, and welcome to episode 133 of the Irish Baseball Podcast. I'm your host, Rick Becker. Before I tell you about today's show, I have to share a huge thank you to everyone listening. This episode marks our 5-year anniversary. Every other week for the past half-decade, I have brought you a brand new episode of the Irish Baseball Podcast. I also have to thank John Fitzgerald, the founder of the Irish American Baseball Society, for giving me this platform. The format is very different than it was when we started, and I think the changes have been critical in allowing us to pull off the major project I've been working on for this year. In honor of the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, I'm conducting interviews that highlight the Irish immigrant and Irish American impact on the history of the United States. Today, we'll have a topic that discusses the intersection of Irish American history and the game we all love. Baker has written a book on famous baseball player, manager, and coach, Kid Gleason. He's here today to discuss Gleason for more than just the scandal that took place under his leadership. Let's get right to today's conversation. Thanks for being here, Dirk.
Great to be here, and let's talk some baseball.
And the first appearance that you made on the Irish Baseball Podcast, you kind of teased that you were working on a book on Kid Gleason. And now that book is becoming a reality. So why don't you talk about, first of all, just what's going on with that project, and we'll move from there.
Well, shout out to you. You took an interest in the book and the idea back in the day, and I didn't have a publisher back then, so thanks to you for maybe kicking the door in on this. So the publisher is McFarland. They're out of North Carolina. They're a history, education, but they specialize in dead ball era baseball, and this will actually be my third book with them, but my first major one, which is a biography on William Kid Gleason, second-generation Irishman from Philadelphia, longtime player, coach, manager, and it's the title is, after the Black Sox scandal, so his life beyond the Black Sox.
Right. I would imagine that a lot of our listeners, if they have heard of Kid Gleason, it is because he was the manager of the 1919 Chicago White Sox, notoriously 8 men out through the World Series. But there already is a book, 8 men out, right? Everybody has talked about the Black Sox, the 1919 World Series. They've talked about Shoeless Joe. They've even talked about Kid Gleason and how he dealt with what happened. However, there was an entire very, very respectable Major League Baseball career for Kid Gleason before and after 1919. So why don't you talk about how that one unfortunate moment has sort of clouded his legacy?
Everyone that I've asked, my own players, other authors, just general people talking, at a baseball game, I always give them my little business card, which actually I believe has your logo, little Irish baseball there. And I always go like this. I give them the card and I said, who's Kid Gleason? And they say, I have no idea. And I go, well, that's good because you're going to buy my book. This guy played 22 seasons. He was a switch hitter, a pitcher, infielder. He was a coach. He won 3 World Series as a coach, White Sox and 2 with the Philadelphia A's. He won pennants as a player with the old Orioles. He mentored. I have a connection that, he has a personal connection to 47 Hall of Famers and was directly responsible for the development and growth of about almost 10 of these guys that, he took under his wing. And whether it was pitching, catching, infield, outfield. This guy literally did it all besides drive the bus. But if automobiles had existed back when he played, he probably would have done that too.
When he was the manager of the 1919 World Series team, and we are not going to focus that much on that era, but his portrayal in the movie, in the book, was that he had some inkling that something was up when that was happening. And he could tell that there were rumors. He could see that some of his players weren't, putting forth their best effort, if you will. Did he know at the time that this moment was going to have such an impact on him? Or was gambling at the time so prevalent that he just thought, I'm going to lose a World Series and nothing else is going to come of it because, it might have happened in the previous World Series. It might have happened in the World Series before that, the one that they won. So what was he thinking when that whole situation was happening?
I'll hit every one of those questions. People today, it's 100 or more years. The anniversary was 2019. So we're talking 100 plus years. If I mention Kid Gleason, they just assume that he was part of the fix, where he was one of the first, if not the first, to either say something to a reporter. He went to Comiskey. He tried to get his words out. But people back then, everyone gambled on the game. It was like steroids in the 90s. You just assumed everybody did it, even though it was illegal. Then you got him after game one. Now, again, they were favored to win. He had a juggernaut, but his ace got blown out 9-1. Well, what happened in 1988? You seem to remember the Dodgers. Their MVP, Kirk Gibson, was hurt, right?
Right.
There have been upsets in World Series in the past. They've been gambling allegations, 1918, the Miracle Braves of 14. Gambling was just rampant back then. So to lose game one, but then they lose game two. Now it is on the road, so they're going to go back to Chicago. So Gleason was a fiery guy, so he was upset. So he's trying to figure out what's going on. Now, whether or not apparently Joe Jackson asked out of game one. And so he's hearing all these grumblings. They lose the first two games. Comiskey supposedly goes to Ban Johnson and then the National League president. And there's all these different, smoke and mirrors and questions about, what happened. But it's pretty apparent that we could say games 1, 2, and 8 were fixed. Dickie Kerr threw a shutout in game 3, which no one saw that coming. Then I guess when the guys weren't paid, they started to try to win. And then Cicotti pitches a great game 7. They win an extra, I believe Kerr pitches game 6, and they win an extra inning. Cicotte, the game 1 guy, he comes back and wins 7. So if they win game 8, they go to a game 9, and Lefty gets booted out or yanked out in the first inning. Supposedly, they had threatened him and his wife. That's one of my main goals. I got to find some facts on that because they said the author, Elliot Asinoff, made that up. But I do have something that Lefty Williams in his testimony saying, grand jury in front of saying that he was threatened. Now, was he threatened? Would they say he was going to kill his wife? He can't protect you. So anyway, you got all that. So they lose in 8 games. The amazing thing is Kid Gleason won 3 games in that World Series with half his team trying to lose. And he hung around to 23. He had all these health issues. Connie Mack grabs him. He's back in baseball. And then he ends up with one of the greatest dynasties in baseball history, the Philadelphia A's of the late 20s. And then he passed away in January of 33. But 10,000 people showed up to his funeral, Kid Gleason. Wow. This guy knew everybody. They knew him. He was buddies with Landis, with Ban Johnson, with the other managers. They said he never had an enemy. Just an interesting guy. And you'll love this, that I like to write and I like to talk, as you can probably tell here, that I had to have a word count through the publisher, and I had to get rid of like a third of the book I actually might have a volume 2 from all the deleted information. So mark that down for episode number 3 if the volume 2 comes out. So
Amazing, amazing. Yeah, one of the great things over the past 5 years of doing these interviews is when you're talking to Irish people and people of Irish descent, you don't have to ask too many questions to fill up a whole episode.
I'm not Irish, but I love Notre Dame football. So there you go.
The answers tend to be long when you're talking to a lot of Irish people.
And I
So
don't have any pints, no pints today either.
we say he moved on to work with Connie Mack, another great Irish baseball legend, a member of the Irish American Baseball Hall of Fame. What type of impact did Connie Mack have on Kid Gleason? And, you know, we had somebody on earlier who did a book on Daniel Murphy, a great underrated Irish American baseball player. So we have Connie Mack coming up again and again during this time in baseball. I know your book is about Kid Gleason, but what was the impact of Connie Mack on the game? Because he'll come in and he'll take somebody who, you know, may have been like Kid Gleason, involved in a scandal, and he'll bring him back and give him the credibility. And he'll take somebody like Daniel Murphy, who he had a falling out with him, but then, you know, they'll reconnect and he'll bring him back into the game. Can you talk a little bit about Connie Mack and how he wasn't just a manager, he wasn't just an owner, he was a huge part of the game and played a major impact on so many people?
And I don't think he gets enough love from baseball history. I mean, everyone knows who Connie Mack is. They know he was, you know, he never wore a uniform. He won kind of 2 dynasties because he had to, you know, sell off his players so the team wouldn't go under. But Gleason had bumped into Connie. You know, obviously back then he knew him because he was a Philly guy. You know, Gleason is from Philly. And then he played for the Phillies, and then he coached with the Phillies. So, you know, I'm sure they crossed paths, but Gleason was at the 25 World Series in Pittsburgh when the A's were playing in the World Series. And Connie, like you just said, he looked out for him. You know, he looked deathly ill. He's like, I'm never going to coach, you know, So he gave him his pet project of working one of his guys back, and he had him, you know, he's living in Philly. He's like, come on over to Shibe Park and work with the guys. And the next thing you know, he offers him a job. And the same thing happened with me at Salve Regina. I kind of had a similar fiasco happen with my coaching career. So when I joined Salve, I was out of the mix for a couple of years, just like Gleason. And Eric Sorrella, the coach, is like, just come on and down. I was like, well, do you want to talk? He goes, no, you're in. I know you. And then he just says, just coach. Well, that's what Connie Mack did. He told Gleason, just coach. And there was this rumor going around that they called them loggerheads. They were at loggerhead. They were battling. And it was all made up because no one could get in an argument with Connie Mack. He was like Santa Claus, for crying out loud. Gleason coached the bases. He threw batting practice, hit the fungos. And then they had Eddie Collins on board. Ty Cobb was there, Tris Speaker, Lefty Grove, Jimmy Fox, Mickey Cochran. I mean, you talk about falling into a good situation, and it's almost like Gleason deserved that because of what had happened. They actually won more games in 1920 than they did 19 when he was the manager, even though it was an extended schedule. But still, you know, he tried to imagine half your team and your 2 top guys getting yanked under you. I mean, just there's no way. So, yeah, Connie Mack, he's got that whole code of conduct. You know, you can't swear. He doesn't want you fighting, no drinking. And this was, as you know, back then, that was common for those guys to get a little out of control. So, and Gleason was no angel. He had his run-ins. But they said he was always, you know, in support of a friend or if someone messed with him. I even have this little cartoon of him as a little leprechaun with his dukes up. The fighting Irishman, like the Notre Dame. So, Connie Mack was definitely, John McGraw, they consider him, maybe the greatest manager of all time with the 10 pennants. He was a teammate of his for 2 years. So Gleason is like, I actually have this hierarchy of, he's got bloodlines somewhat connected with every manager in the big leagues today. Now you really gotta stretch it out like an elastic band, going back to Ned Halen and Harry Wright and all these guys from back in the day. But whether or not Kid Gleason had somewhat of an influence, the players loved him. They called him Kid. He was strict. They said he had that barber's leather belt that he would whack his players with. I mean, but nobody messed with the guy. And he would stick up for his players on and off the field. And again, I don't want to give away the book, but
absolutely,
I believe it or not, I'm actually trying to. I've nominated him for a Legends Award through the Sabre Society of American Baseball Research and also the Buck O'Neill Award through the Hall of Fame. So we'll see.
One of the things that we're doing, especially this year with the 250th anniversary of the United States, one of the things we're trying to do is highlight many historical figures with Irish heritage, whether they be Irish immigrants or Irish Americans, because the impact that the Irish have had on the country is huge. But the impact that they had on our favorite game of baseball is maybe even bigger. There are so many early Irish figures, and Kid Gleason is one of them. And he's not a figure that is in danger of being lost, but his real impact might be lost because of this one story that overshadows everything. You mentioned that he was really loyal. How did he react towards those 8 players? Was he still supportive of them? He had to manage them for an entire season after that happened. A lot of people don't know this if you just watch the movie 8 Men Out, but the entire 1920 season, these players were still playing while sports writers were collecting all this evidence that they threw the 1919 World Series. They knew something might be coming down the pike, and they played with this shadow hovering over them. There were rumors that the gamblers came back and said, you're going to have to throw games down the stretch in the 1920 season, and that might be why they didn't make it back to the World Series in 1920, that they said, hey, we're going to go to the authorities if you don't throw these games down the stretch. How did Gleason react to those 8 players?
You've definitely done your homework on this one, so kudos to you. First off, about the Irishman, you got Ed Delahunty, you got Pat Moran, you got McGraw, and there's just dozens of other guys. I mean, that's a good point. I'm going to come up with my all-Irish baseball team by position. I'm going to start taking some notes, and I'm going to send it to you. But from the dead ball, from back then, I would just love to have been a bug on the wall at that end of the 20 season. So, they were within a half a game of the Indians in September. Now, we're pretty sure that the Black Sox were throwing games not only in 1919, but 1920, and possibly before. And then you mentioned 1917. There's this whole big thing about that they paid off the Tigers for 4 wins, which now they didn't win the pennant by 4 games, but the fact that the Tigers just laid down because they get supposedly paid off. And then they did the same thing to in 19. So in 17, the Tigers laid down, so they win the pennant. And then the Tigers got some wins from the White Sox in 19, hoping to get, quote, 3rd or 4th place money. So, I mean, there's all these different scenarios that are all tied into this. But so Gleason in the movie says they're the greatest team ever, period, right? I had my buddy or a researcher go to the Chicago History Museum to find Gleason's testimony from the trial. Doesn't exist. Now, you think back then, there's no tape recorders, right? Everything is, shorthand or what. I'm saying to myself, how can there not be Gleason's testimony? So did he say that? I've checked every newspaper under the sun from when he tested. He didn't say that. Now, he never badmouthed his guys after that trial ended. He was adamant saying they'll, after 1920, if these guys are proven guilty, they're never going to play for me. And if they join the team, I'm not coaching them. So he did say that. But the fact that he never badmouthed them after the fact, that says a lot about loyalty to his guy. He doesn't agree with them. Ruin their careers, ruin his potential careers. But again, he's a player's manager. The interesting thing is, none of these guys talked. Even the Clean Sox, no one talked after that. And I think you hit a nail on the head. The gamblers must have got to these guys and said, you're going to keep your mouth shut. You're not going to mention my name, or there's going to be fit you for some cement shoes, type thing. You're going to turn up in the harbor. So Joe Jackson and Gandil and all these other guys, they didn't say anything until Gandil comes out and Shoeless Joe comes out like 20 years later. They're basically at their deathbed. Their lives are over. They're living in obscurity. No one cared at that point. But back then, if Joe Jackson came out and gave the whole spiel after that trial or right before the trial, but the kicker is, it was when this guy, Billy Mahag, and he's in the movie, he wanted some of the, quote, ransom money for evidence because he had lost bid. He basically lost his shirt in the World Series gambling. He wanted to collect on this ransom from Comiskey by giving information. And Comiskey stiffed the guy. He sent him travel expense. He offers 10 grand. He gives him the evidence. It turns out to be all true. And he only gives him travel expenses. I mean, classic stuff. So he squawks. And then literally like the day or two after, Seacott squawks, then Joe, then Lefty Williams, and then Risberg squawks to another reporter. So I think 4 of them ended up admitting it. I think Risberg, the shortstop, went to his grave saying he was innocent. I mean, he was probably one of the ringleaders. So yeah, Gleason, he stuck by his guys. I can't imagine trying to manage in that World Series with all the scuttlebutt and all the rumors. And then, like you said, to go to the next year with the cloud, and they're still in the front. They're going into their last series of the year at St. Louis with all their guns healthy and ready to go. And then this guy goes to the press. Comiskey suspends him. It would be interesting because all this guy did was, this gambler is ticked off because he lost his money. Why doesn't Comiskey just wait until after the season to get real proof? But he suspended him, and we now know that Comiskey covered the whole thing up because he knew. People were telling him when the World Series was going on in 19 that this stuff was going on, and then he suspends the guys. So, yeah, they do play in 20, and then the trial is July of 21. They get acquitted, and then the next day Landis says, I don't care, you're out. The guys are never playing again. So
Kid Gleason was never at all even rumored to be a part of this fix. And there was another player of Irish descent who was not rumored to be a part of the fix, and that is Eddie Collins, who then also went on to play under Gleason and under Connie Mack with the Philadelphia A's. Why don't you talk a little bit about Eddie Collins? He is in the Hall of Fame.
If you look at all the stuff, Collins is probably the greatest all-around second baseman in history. Joe Morgan, obviously, because he, tremendous player, Hall of Famer. But if you take all around, drawing walks, defense, baseball smarts, so you could go, you can't go wrong with either of those guys. So Schalk is in. Now, Ed Walsh had just retired, so he wasn't on the 19 team. But Red Faber was on the 19 team. but he had malaria from the war. So he wasn't really kind of in the mix in 19. He was more in the mix after 1919. And he was the hero, believe it or not, of the 17 World Series with 3 wins. But yeah, Collins is a clean sock. You got Schalk, the catcher. But then you got 3 of the infielders are guilty. 2 of the outfielders. The right fielders were a platoon left-right guy. The top 2 pitchers were Black Sox. Dickie Kerr was clean. Faber was sick, and they said if Faber was healthy, they would have won. Well, they didn't win. He wasn't healthy, and the Sox threw the series. So there you go. The White Sox, arguably, Chicago was the baseball city of the decade with the Cubs and the White Sox. Now, the Red Sox were awesome back then, but the Braves, they had won 1. So you could make a case that, Chicago and Boston, but Chicago was definitely a happening place during that time. And it's pretty amazing that how great the Cubs and the White Sox were during that decade, or you could say even 20 years, that both stunk for the next 100 years. So they were both kind of jinxed. The Billy Goat Tavern, the Chicago curse and all this stuff. And Eddie Collins, and if of all the people in Gleason's life, I would say Collins was the closest person to him.
Wow.
And when Gleason collapsed, he collapsed on the platform in a train, but he's laying there, and Collins is beside himself. And in the passage that I have, he's like he now saw his greatest friend because he now knows that he's failing. So you can't make that stuff up.
Right. It's an interesting situation where you have these 2, major figures like Collins and Gleason who didn't have anything to do with it, and nobody ever accused them of having anything to do with it. I think that we know from Collins' relationship with some of the other players on the team that it probably wasn't going to happen. They probably weren't going to let him in on it anyway. And they did allow them to continue to, move forward. When you look at some of the modern scandals, like the Astros scandal in 2017, that time period, a lot of those players, even some of them who were rookies at the time, still hold, that scarlet letter from that time period. But I guess it was a much tighter community, a much tighter organization, Major League Baseball at the time. So people knew the character of a lot of these players. So even if they were on a team with players who were crooked, they could tell, now I'm pretty sure that guy wouldn't do this or this guy wouldn't do that, because it was a smaller group at the time. There were only, 8 teams in each league, and you didn't have so many players. Everybody knew each other. It was a much different community at the time. We only have a couple minutes left, and I do want to get to why you thought this book was so important to write, why it was important to say Kid Gleason was more than just the manager of this team that created such a huge controversy.
I was never a big old dead ball baseball person. I was more modern baseball. There was no interest in me. There's no video. You could just read the books. But after COVID happened, I started to get into not only the Vietnam War, but I got into the Black Sox, and it was the 100-year anniversary. So all these documentaries are coming out. And then I'm saying, why isn't there more on this guy, Kid Gleason? I mean, He's in the movie, he's in the book. And then, Wikipedia had some stuff on it. And I was like, not bored. I guess I was bored. I wanted to find out about it. And then I'm like, wow, guy was a switch hitter. He had 38 wins on the bump for the Phillies. He won pennants with the Orioles. He played with all these guys. His obituary, January 3rd, 1933. I would love to put a check mark and count how many major headlines across the country this was national news when he passed away. He was like a dignitary. I've written books in the past. I'm, a journalist. So I've definitely been a writer. And then you combine the baseball. I've never done a biography. And, I hired a genealogist for this to do the ancestry background, you name it. The best part that I want to give a shout out to is I'm not financially, this isn't a New York Times bestseller yet. So I have to be careful of the finances. So I couldn't hire a professional editor for 500 pages. It would have cost me $5,000 or something. So I started to ask other published authors like yourself, who know the game, have a particular interest in one of the time periods. And I got about 35 people to edit a chapter each, and not anybody. No one asked to get paid. I sent them a bunch of swag and stuff. And that really helped me out to make sure the facts were correct. It was a transition. Am I repeating myself? And they all said to me, they said, they can't wait to hear about this. This book about Kid Gleason is long overdue. And whether or not we have a second volume, and I'm hoping that this serves as a springboard for another one down the way.
They always say that if there's a book you want to read and you can't find it, that means you have to write it. And that's what you did with Kid
Is that your line? That's a great line.
No, it is not my line. It is.
I like that.
Yeah, it is gone through the ethos here. And I just thought with the 250th anniversary of the United States, us taking a big look this year at the Irish immigrant and Irish American impact on the country, it was really important to revisit Kid Gleason, who was a great Irish American. He was a great and just a giant, like you said, almost a dignitary in this sport that we all love. And we wouldn't have the modern game if it wasn't for people like Kid Gleason, who, after this huge scandal that could have completely destroyed the national pastime, and then Eddie Collins and Connie Mack and Kid Gleason, they go out and help save the game. Yes, it was probably more Babe Ruth, but these players and these coaches, they went out and they kept trucking, and they did what they thought they had to do to preserve the game of baseball. Whatever you think about any commissioners that have come, even dating back to Kennesaw Mountain Landis and some horrible, horrible decisions he made, still instituting a commissioner, all of these things that they did in the aftermath are the only reasons that we still have Major League Baseball to this day. And they made a lot of mistakes, but they did save the game. And now we have this sport that we love. And Kid Gleason is one of the reasons why. So Dirk Baker, thank you so much for delving into this topic. And thank you for joining us for a second episode of the Irish Baseball Podcast.
And thanks to you for keeping baseball our national pastime with shows like this.
Once again, thank you for helping us reach this amazing milestone. Whether you've been listening for the entire 5 years, or if this is your first episode listening, we couldn't continue to do this without you. As always, we will have another brand new episode in 2 weeks. On February 23rd, I'll be talking to Scott Crawford of the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame. Crawford will be talking about the Toronto Blue Jays' 2025 run to the World Series, the excitement in Canada about the upcoming World Baseball Classic, and the recent documentary on how the Montreal Expos ended up leaving the Great White North. I'm your host, Rick Becker, and this has been episode 133 of the Irish Baseball Podcast.